Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to another enriching session of the ICS Wednesday seminar. My name is Alok, and I am a research intern at ICS. I have the honor of serving as the master of ceremony for today's session. I extend a heartfelt welcome to each and every one of you who has joined us. The title for today's seminar is Why China Will Avoid an All-Out Confrontation. Why China will avoid an all-out confrontation with the US in the Middle East following the Gaza war. Before we begin, allow me to provide a brief introduction for today's topic. The war in Gaza has led to the emergence of a new arena of competition in the West Asia, Middle East, and the North Africa region. Despite the apparent thaw in relations between US and China, competition between the two giants has been a persistent phenomenon that stretches across geopolitical, geo-economic, and geocultural dimensions. China is trying to leverage the situation to weaken US influence in the region after its successful role in the Saudi-Iranian negotiations. The seminar will throw light on China's effort to compete with the US on geo-economic rather than on the security or geopolitical front. The speaker for today's seminar is Mr. Atul Aneja, who is the editor of India Narrative. He was formerly the strategic affairs editor of the Hindu newspaper and was posted in Beijing between August 2014 and January 2020 as associate editor. He was also the West Asia correspondent for the Hindu based in Bahrain and Dubai from August 2002 to June 2014. The chair for today's seminar is Dr. Hemant Adlaka. He is an associate professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is also the chairperson and honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. His area of research include political discourse in the PRC and modern Chinese literature and culture. His most recent publications include Trust Building Between the US and China, Lessons from the Cold War, and Knowing China, Sinomania to Sinophobia, a chapter in the book India-China Dialogues Beyond Borders. Before I hand over the session to the chair, I will request all participants to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants will remain muted during the presentations. Questions can be posted in the chat box during the event, or you can raise your hand during the interactive session. And after the session, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask the question. We request you all to mention a name and designation while asking the question. That will be all. I now hand over the floor to Dr. Adlaka to take the proceedings forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both, Muskan and Alok. I also thank Alka and the ICS for inviting me to be in the role of chairing this very important and relevant discussion presentation by Atul. I'll call him Atul because our association goes back to decades. Better to be informal with Atul rather than be formal. I hope you will not mind. I mean, as the introduction has been done to the topic, and those of you who have seen the abstract of Atul, which has been circulated in the notice, I'll skip that and rather use this few minutes in various remarks to just share with everyone my sense of the topic and also to put it in a broader context and to bring in wider dimension for the discussion. Just a couple of observations. I mean, as the topic has already been read out by Alok, it's a very interesting topic. I mean, let me repeat the topic in order to emphasize why I find the topic very relevant and interesting. Why China will avoid an all-out confrontation with the US in the Middle East following the Gaza war. And I am repeating this topic also in order to give the other side of the argument, which is that, I mean, if you look at the recent discourse, especially following the 7th October, both in Chinese media as well as in the Western media, When China trying to avoid an all-out confrontation with the US following the Gaza crisis or conflict. In fact, this whole issue is the product of, if I may say, of the US media and the US think tanks and the US policymakers, especially some White House officials and also some think tanks like the Atlantic and the Hill, etc. And we do not actually find any direct or indirect, even an indication from the Chinese. China is aspiring to, or China is desirous of either confronting the US in the Middle East post 7th October, or even aspiring to replace or displace US military presence or US as a leader in the Middle East. That is why I find this very interesting theme is discussion. And in fact, the argument is turned on its head, if I can say that it is in the interest of China to continue to perhaps manipulate the US security umbrella in the region to protect its own core interests. Without the US security architecture in the Middle East as it prevails today, perhaps China will have problems in protecting its core interest in the region. And the core interest, if I can just point out in three different ways. One is that, as we all know perhaps, that China is the largest importer of oil from the region. Second, China is also the largest investor in the region. And third, China is also perhaps involved in the largest number of developmental projects. Now, of course, as part of the alliance in the region. So, keeping these three core interests, I don't think China is even debating when we look at the Chinese debates of any kind of challenging the US dominance or all-out confrontation with the US in the region. Primarily also because China does not have the capability from the military point of view to secure its own interest in the region when it comes to security. And also perhaps the kind of goodwill which China enjoys in the region, especially I am referring to the peace agreement which China succeeded in bringing about between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because in some of the Western writings, that peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia is also being referred to as one of the reasons that why China would be thinking of challenging the US dominance or becoming the regional leader by displacing the US in the region, etc. etc. So even if we look at the peace agreement which China brought about between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that was possible because of the goodwill China enjoys. And at best, one can say that post 7th October, what China has done very effectively is that China has utilized the anti-Israel and anti-US sentiments in the Middle East and in the region to project itself, that is China itself, in the as a leader, perhaps, or as a spokesperson, perhaps, against the Israel atrocities in Gaza post 7th October in the global South. What China has been very effectively doing, and therefore somebody, John Hoffman, for example, of foreign policy, called China perhaps the manipulator, the manipulative power in the region post 7th October, rather than the revisionist power trying to confront or displace or replace US dominance in the region. With these very tentative and simple observations, without further ado, I don't want to come in the way of you and Atul. I request and invite Atul to make his presentation for roughly 35 to 40 minutes, and then we go into a question answer round. Okay, Atul?
Half an hour is also with me. 35 minutes, you're being generous. Thanks. But I think I should be able to wrap up in 30 minutes, but maximum it might spill over to 35 minutes a month because I would really like more discussion to come. And so thanks. Thank you very much, Hemant. And thank you, Alka, for organizing this. And everyone who is present here, and welcome on board. The topic has already been well known to you. Why China would avoid a confrontation, all-out confrontation. The word all-out is important because there might be a confrontation, but it can't be a military confrontation, not a all-out confrontation. And that's what I meant when I was sort of trying to pick on the topic and try being a journalist, trying to be as precise as possible. Sometimes you succeed in that. Quite often you fail, but you always attempt. So, and I also meant this in this context of the region because it is confined to the Gaza war and its implications. I would like to come to a conclusion only after giving a little bit of a context to this situation. And by that, I mean a global context to it. I think with the arrival of Xi Jinping in China, a new phase in Chinese foreign policy has begun. China is no longer shy of asserting its interests, its core interests. There is no value judgment in that. Every nation has a right to assert its core interests. And China did so for several reasons, which can go later. The stage of development which China had reached by the time of 2012, 2013, when there was, there was enough surplus capital, actually. If you really go back and look at writers like Hobson and others, I mean, when did really the colonial powers, I think there's a lot of difference between colonial powers and China, but just to give is a broad example, around 1900 or so, there was surplus capital in Europe, and it needed new markets, new areas to tap into, both for resources and for markets. It did so in a very different and a very imperialist way. But if you really look at what has happened around 2013, 2014, I think the whole Deng Xiaoping era, starting from after Mao's death in 1976, and then taking off from 79 onwards, I mean, and then the benchmark of 1997 or so, when you have Zhu Rongji and his reforms coming up, where China really develops its economy, becomes the workshop of the world, and acquires that excess capital. And there is an inner driver within China to explore, to go forward, and to look at new markets and new resources, but of course not in the old way of the colonial powers. And that's where Belt and Road Initiative and several others outgoing initiatives under Xi Jinping come into play. If you look at it, the biggest rival, I don't think this is a Cold War because we're in the era of globalization, but the biggest point of friction really was with the United States, a country with which China had very warm and excellent relations during the Deng Xiaoping era. And when I was posted in China around 2013, it was a revelation to me, the closeness of the US Chinese ties, whether it was in technology, whether it was in the markets, whether on the economic side, and even on the geopolitical side. The talk at that time was about establishment of G2, if I recall. that is China and US sort of being on the driver's seat in global governance. But by the time Xi Jinping comes to power, I think that's where the competition with the US really heightens up. To cut a long story short, and you could see that in various geographies which are coming in. We are familiar with what's happening in the South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean, in Africa. But I think one benchmark to me was really Afghanistan in 2021, August 15, the exit of the Americans from Afghanistan. And after the exit, I think both Russia and China were determined, along with most of the Central Asian countries, though not all, in ensuring that there is no comeback of the Americans into Afghanistan. And though Pakistan seems to be under Nawaz Sharif, if he comes to power, as the gateway of a comeback, but the real intention was really to see the exit and then to extend the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is the part of the Belt and Road Initiative, into Afghanistan from Kashgar, where it currently terminates. So Afghanistan also being a very important resource-rich country, a country with critical minerals, with lithium reserves. So the China was looking far and did not want the Americans to really come back into Afghanistan. You look at other geographies, without going into a direct confrontation, but look at countries like Angola, which is of course oil, but Congo, which is again rare earths and lithium reserves, because Chinese have moved forward into electric car, a new economy where you have transitioned from the earlier model, which was all real estate driven, infrastructure driven growth and export oriented growth, into high tech development. So with the outreach into countries like Afghanistan or in Africa was really to connect with the new economy of China, which was evolving. And so you find that competition with the Americans in those theaters. And along with that is with the US pivot to Asia, the confrontation or the friction between China and the United States increasing, Taiwan being the sort of a flashpoint for that, but all across the Indo-Pacific and especially the West Pacific. So when this competition between the Chinese and the Americans were heating up, I think Chinese did its own pivot, which has it's not been noticed, but the relevance of it or the importance of it has perhaps not been noted enough, which is the pivot to the Middle East or to West Asia, North Africa, as we tend to call it in India. But I think internationally, and especially younger people, are more acquainted with MENA, Middle East and North Africa. I think that's where, once the pressure and the sanctions started coming in on high-tech materials, chips, etc., from the United States, Chinese adjusted accordingly. And their outreach to the Middle East became much more pointed, sharp, and purpose-oriented than before. Hemant mentioned that the energy relationship, which was always there, especially with the GCC countries, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the 6 countries, which are most of them are oil producing, except for the exception perhaps of Bahrain, which was an oil producing country, but has sort of the reserves are sort of drying out of there. From China gets about 50% of its oil needs from this region, from the GCC countries. And it is expected that this figure will reach 77% by 2030. So the importance of the GCC has increased both from an energy security perspective, but also the amount of trade, let's say, between China and GCC is astounding. It's now $330 billion. And now you have the Chinese construction companies getting big time into developing infrastructure in the region. And about $126 billion in construction projects are there in these countries right now. China has become the largest investor in GCC with that. Also, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, the Middle East is the fulcrum of the railway projects which the Chinese are considering under this framework. So it's a very pointed pivot to the Middle East, partly on account of the pressure which the Chinese are facing from the Americans, and they have found their outlet more in this region. And that explains the importance of this region, which will have its impact on the response which the Chinese have adopted to the war in Gaza. There are other reasons why the Chinese and the GCC countries or the entire Middle East is bonding, especially with the petromonarchies. I think they are comfortable. The Chinese are comfortable with the petromonarchies, forward-looking petromonarchies, and development-oriented petromonarchies. This is and the GCC countries especially find they are comfortable with this because of the recent history with the United States. I think two events I would like to point out in this context. The first is the Arab Spring. Now, this movement for so-called democracy, which took place between 2010 to, let's say, 2013, 14, or even earlier to 2010 to 12, at the peak when the Arab Spring, which I was fortunate to cover when I was with the Hindu. Well, these democracy movements were really posed as, were interpreted as existential threats by the petromonarchies, minus Qatar. Qatar is an outlier here. But if you look at the other countries, especially UAE and Saudi Arabia, they were petrified by the Arab Spring and the Americans' role in sort of spawning and driving that particular movement for democracy. And that was a turning point in the thinking of some of these countries, because this reliance on the United States and the West, I think that took a hit because of the Arab Spring. And it is a pivotal moment, as I see it, because that's where then they start exploring a better relationship with countries outside the West. And China becomes a prime partner, has been identified as a prime partner by these countries. And I'm especially singling out the UAE and Saudi Arabia for that. This relationship, let's say with UAE, if you take it, it grows manifold. For example, there is a $1 billion fund which has been created by the UAE and China for investments in Africa, for example. $2 billion has been invested by the Emiratis in this car project of the Chinese, which is, I think it's NIO is the brand name of the Chinese car company. Actually, just a correction, UAE has already invested $10 billion in the China-led fund for Africa. And there are more than 4,000 Chinese companies already operating in the UAE, and that targets about 100 million population of the Gulf region. The stock exchanges of Shanghai and UAE have established direct connections with each other on the investment front. And there is a company called CYVN Holdings, an investment fund controlled by Abu Dhabi government. It has invested 2.2 billion in NIO, which I was talking about. And then you look at, the Khalifa port, for example, in Abu Dhabi. That becomes a gateway for Chinese trade in Africa and other places, especially Africa. So you see the pace at which the relationship between China and the UAE has grown, for example, manifold, and it is also not, its footprint is found far beyond the GCC countries, especially in the global south, and which is Africa. Hemant was hinting at that. I think global south has become very, very important for the Chinese as it unrolls and goes to the next level of its rise. And if you look at Saudi Arabia, I think Saudi Arabia was petrified by the way the US responded to the Khashoggi affair, which was the killing of the journalist in the Turkish embassy in Ankara, or it was a consulate in Istanbul. I'm not forgetting that right now. But that murder of Khashoggi and the hostility with which the Americans approached the Saudis, with a new leadership under Mohammed bin Salman coming up in Saudi Arabia, assertive new leader, thinks independent. I think the US, Saudi Arabia also took a big hit. And that became also, in a way, a turning point in shoring up or adding much more momentum to the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Chinese, which has grown manifold. If you look at the Line City which the Saudis are developing, it's a futuristic project of a new kind of city, and extremely modern. And the Chinese are major investors in the Line City now, which will become a show window for a new Saudi Arabia, which is going on its plan 2030 of delinking from or at least reducing its dependence from oil, but going more into renewable energy, etc. And the Chinese companies are coming in big time with the Saudis out there. Costco, the Chinese company, the shipping company, is now the major player in the Middle East. So the point I'm making is that it's a discovery of the Middle East by the Chinese, which because of circumstances which have emerged in South China Sea and other geographies, and with the competition with the US heightening, this is the region. This is a pivotal region which the Chinese, the pivot to the Middle East, I would say, of China, is exceptionally important for its futuristic plans. What happens to the relationship between China and Israel? I think that's something we need to examine a bit of a detail. If you look at the period of Mao, it was completely pro-Palestinian. But then when you get into the Deng Xiaoping era, then there is a rapprochement with the Israelis, and it goes to great depth. And there was a time when they created, I think not too long ago, a $1 billion fund, basically on the high-tech side. Development. So while the Chinese continue to take pro-Palestinian positions, they always balanced it with Israel. And in actual practice, the geo-economic relationship between Israel and China continued uninterrupted. And the Haifa port was being, that's something where the Chinese have a stake. So it was all moving in that direction. I think 2018 becomes a point when the Americans sort of get uneasy with the Israel-China relationship, and all Chinese projects thereafter face far greater difficulties in Israel than they were pre-2018. And when you take the high-tech sector, partly because of sanctions from the US on computer chips, etc., the Chinese have had to were forced into self-reliance and innovation of their own. And frankly, if you see some of the new Huawei phones, they're almost as good as Apple, with processors which are made in China. So that dependence on high-tech of Israel on China has decreased. And that has freed China and given it far more room for maneuver than it was in the pre-2018 context. And I think that is getting reflected in the rather one-sided position which the Chinese have taken after what happened in October 7th last year. And the Chinese statements seem to be reflective of that. When you do not condemn the Hamas in any of the statements for what was done on October 7th to the Israelis, you use the word collective punishment in your statements far more frequently. At the same time, I think the Chinese are least interested in a regional war. The conflict sort of permeating out of Gaza area and then getting into Lebanon. And if Lebanon gets into the fray, then the relationship of Lebanese Hezbollah and Iran will come into the picture. I don't think the Chinese, and I agree with Hemant on that they're really interested in a regional conflict. But let's look at this in a little more detail. Again, I have to come back to the Arab Spring, and here comes the killing of Muammar Gaddafi, which takes place in October 2011. I think this is a very important year. If you recall, when there was the new fly zone created on Libya, uh, the Chinese and the Russians, when it came to resolutions in the UN Security Council, they would abstain from that. And allowing the West to do what it wanted. And so, Hemant's argument is right to that extent. At least till that period, they were not willing to change any status quo or challenge the West in a major way. But I think something happens in October of that year with the killing of Gaddafi under the no-fly zone pretext, and the voting pattern of both Russia and China changes in the UN Security Council. Instead of abstaining from any resolutions, when the resolution came on Syria, for example, which was again primed up for regime change, if you recall, towards the end of 2011, the Chinese and the Russians actually block it by vetoing it. I think, and I mean, it was out of curiosity, it was something as to why did they change track? What really happened? And my own investigation at that time as a correspondent in the Middle East, I mean, the conclusion I came to is that for both China and Russia, their core area of interest is Eurasia. And that has to be safeguarded at any cost. And Syria became the first defense line for both Russia and China. China did not intervene actively as the Russians did by sending military planes, establishing a base or reviving a base in Tartus. But they prevented a regime change from taking place in Syria because Syria was very important. Because had Syria fallen, the next in line, in my view, would have been Iran. And that would have been catastrophic because Iran was the second and the most important defense line for both these countries. Because if Iran fell and there was regime change in Iran, then Eurasia would have been exposed, that the soft underbelly of China and Russia. So that is where I think they took a call around October 2011 that this much and no more. And that essentially the outlook has remained the same. So when you come to the Gaza war, China's interest is not so much, in my opinion, on Palestine as such, but it is more on Syria. And that is why, to protect Syria, the Lebanese Hezbollah is extremely important. Its role as designated by Iran, and that's a very close relationship, as we all know, the Iran-Hezbollah relationship with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards being physically present. Qasem Soleimani being, the Al-Quds architect of the Al-Quds force and working very closely with Hezbollah. Hezbollah's primary role is not protection of Palestine, but to make sure that there is no regime change in Syria. And I think that is something which remains. So for the Chinese. So and then in case there is a regional war, in case it spills over to Lebanon, that is the northern Israel and Hezbollah opens up, there's a possibility of Iran getting dragged into it, and that's actually a nightmare scenario for the Chinese, because then if the Iranians get dragged into it, and who knows what the conflict would result in terms of military outcomes, because that risks a regime change in Iran, and so the Chinese, it's not in their interest for that to happen, especially when they're riding high, getting the Iranians into the BRICS Plus format, getting them into the SCO, and wanting a stable Middle East for several reasons, right, from energy to investments, etc. So they would not want that to happen. But suppose, now let's go into a little bit of hypothesis. What would drive China to intervene? And in case there is a regional war? In my view, suppose the Iranians get involved in a war with the Israelis as a spillover of Gaza, the Chinese will react, and they will do so with the Russians, along with the Russians, and not alone. No boots on the ground, of course, to protect Iran, because Iran has to be stabilized as the second defense line. to prevent any kind of a regime change virus to spread into China and the Eurasian heartland. So what would the Chinese do? I think initially increase the amount of weaponry to protect to Iran so that it can defend itself against such an onslaught. That would be something, because if you really see some of the writings in the media of last 2 days, it could be orchestrated, it could be deliberate, it could be psyops, saying that the Hamas has been armed with an array of weapons, from smart assault rifle to eavesdropping devices, high-tech equipment, etc. So leave that aside. But I think if Iran gets involved in this war, the Chinese would pump up Iran with whatever way they can without getting boots into the ground. That would be scenario one. But the question then arises, would there be any situation when the Chinese would actually try and put boots on the ground? I mean, I recall that Wolf Warrior 2, Wolf Warrior 1, that movie which came out about Chinese troops going overseas in Africa to protect a company in Sudan, probably, which had been attacked by rebels. It made, I mean, the whole Wolf Warrior narrative follows the release of that movie. There is a consciousness which has been created in the Chinese society of the need to go out somewhere. But my own hunch is that even if such a involvement is required, the Chinese would do something of a Wagner. When I was in Beijing, I met a number of these private security people, ex-PLA, who had opened their own companies to provide protection to Chinese companies who are going overseas in Africa and other geographies, especially Africa. So at best, you might have a Wagner kind of a situation. But then again, there's a rider to that, because what happened with the Russians' experience with Wagner was not exactly with the risk-averse Chinese would want. But given the party's control over everything, much more than the Russians, that would be the maximum they would go to. And so therefore, the Chinese would avoid an all-out confrontation with the Americans, because if Israelis come into the picture, then the Americans get dragged into the war as well. And but regime survival and making sure that your Eurasian heartland is protected is vital for the Chinese. So extreme eventuality would be the one which is a deep spread of the regional war, probably threatening into a third world war kind of situation. That kind of extreme scenario may be a trigger for the Chinese to come into this region. But otherwise, it doesn't make sense for the Chinese to have fighting the Americans in this region, whatever happens to the Gaza war as a fallout of the Gaza war. I think I'll stop there and would be very happy to take questions. Actually, I have not seen the clock, so I don't know whether I've exceeded the 35 minutes. But Hemant, back to you.
Thank you, Atul. No, you haven't exceeded your 35 minutes. You've just this is just about time. And thank you so much, because I think what we have done today is given us a back to history, and that especially when you talked about there was definitely a period where there was intense debates within China also about whether China should be sending out Chinese PLA to protect China's core interests, especially in the regions or in the countries where they have huge investments under the BRI or so that is very interesting. And secondly, although you put it as a hypothesis, but nonetheless did not take away the importance and relevance of your argument, which is that whether Chinese would actually be there physically especially if Iran gets involved, then what happens? I think these are very, very important and very pertinent points you pointed out. I think we can now straight away go to the question and answer session, and I have my own one or two small questions or observations which I will bring in towards the end of the Q&A round, if the time permits. But let us first listen to the questions from the floor and carry forward the discussion. So Alok, I don't see any raised hands. We can give first priority to the raised hand question. If not, then may I request Alok to read out if there are questions in the chat box?
Yes, sir. There is one question in the chat box by Imran Akhtar from Afghanistan. So the first question is, how does China's growing in global influence and desire to be seen as a responsible global power play a role in its avoidance of direct confrontation with the US in the Middle East? And the second question he asks is, how does China's perception of the US military capabilities and its own military capabilities shape its approach towards avoiding an all-out confrontation in the Middle East?
Yeah, so it's a very comprehensive question. You can take another 30 minutes if you like.
No, interesting point. Chinese appreciation of the U.S. military capability. I think Chinese are very realistic in concluding that there's still a huge gap between the American capability, military capability, and the Chinese military capability. If you look at in the maritime domain, you have now what, 3 aircraft carriers which the Chinese have, with the Fujian joining in, and you have the Americans 8 or 9 in the region. So this is just to exemplify that there's a huge gap on that. I think Chinese have a very good deterrent to the US, which is a defensive thing, which is especially when it comes to their missiles. DF-21, DF-17, and the drones which they have developed. And these are called, one is a ballistic missile which can hit aircraft carriers, American aircraft carriers. And one is called the Guam Killer, which can strike up to Guam, which is a major military base or a sort of a base in the Pacific. So, but that's a deterrent. When it comes to actually proactively taking territory, the Chinese are no match right now to the Americans, and the Chinese know it. So that's regarding the US. So that's why they're not right now want a confrontation with the Americans. I thought the Taiwan affair showed it when you had these tensions last year with the Nancy Pelosi's visit. The Chinese would not want to take on the Americans right now. It's just not there, because Xi Jinping has been repeatedly talking about, the need to win wars. The theater command system, which they have started around 2015, is still not in place. And then, of course, you also have problems in the rocket forces in terms of personnel, etc. So I don't think the Chinese, if you look at in its entirety, that the Chinese want a confrontation is because of the asymmetry in the military capability between them and the Americans. What happens 10 years, 15 years down the road? We don't know. By 2035, even Chinese are thinking of 6 to 7 aircraft carriers. So we don't know. And if Taiwan something happens, then they are no longer boxed in these island chains, the 3 island chains which the Americans have around them, right from the time of John Foster Dulles, with Okinawa as the center of encircling China, essentially in the East and South China Sea. So if you get Taiwan, then you break out of that because of the specific characteristic of the port, which the Taiwanese, the depth which it will give you. If there's a Chinese nuclear submarine, there's no way, and deployed from Taiwan, you can't track it. You're into the ocean and you break out of this island chain strategy, which I think is a geopolitical dimension of China's policy towards Taiwan. But we're not there as of now. Regarding their own vision is the GSI, which is the Global Security Initiative, which Xi Jinping aired at the Boa Forum in April 21, 22. Essentially, comprehensive, to be proactive in terms of preventing conflicts. I think that's the thrust of it. There's a debate about it, whether the real intention is conflict avoidance or spread of Chinese influence. I would not, I don't, as a country rises, this is a natural corollary. Because to ensure China's rise, you need a peaceful globe. And then again, the Belt and Road Initiative is spreading to various geographies across the world, especially Global South. So I think it's a natural fallout of China's outreach and outgoing spirit, which has been widely visible from that time. I think that's my response to from the gentleman in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Atul. Thank you, Atul. Before we take on the next question, I just wanted to bring in another dimension to what you have just now explained, whether Chinese would be actually interested in, or are ready, or are capable, or can match America in terms of physically going into these territories or regions for a confrontation, all out or otherwise. I think we have to also take into consideration the internal debates and internal developments on these issues in the party and also outside the party. For example, I mean, what is the political or ideological premise if China were to actually send troops or troops in the areas outside of China, whether to protect Chinese core interest or in other situations? For example, I mean, America, for example, America openly declares and says that America has to protect liberal order, liberal democracy, freedom of speech, free markets, etc., universal values, for example. And therefore, you have American military bases in more than 100 countries or 150 countries, etc., and therefore that is why China does not have military bases outside China. Second, China does not believe in exporting Chinese socialism or Chinese path of development. I mean, if you look at the Chinese party position of even now, even the last party Congress also opened by Xi Jinping first announcing or making its commitment clear and asking all the Communist Party members to adhere to the socialism with Chinese characteristics. Socialism with Chinese characteristics means what? The Chinese model of development is for China only, not for other countries, not China to export to other countries. And if you add Xi Jinping's own ideological dimension to socialism with Chinese characteristics, even that from nowhere suggests that China is interested in exporting Chinese model of development outside China or other countries to follow Chinese model of development. For example, Xi Jinping says Chinese style model. Or even if you go one step further, the CPC says it is in the new era, socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era. Again, there it is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Or in other words, more popularly, it is the Chinese dream. So what I'm saying is that there is no political or ideological premise or program or understanding or line, party line as it were, to actually think of sending Chinese troops or setting up Chinese military bases outside China. So therefore, the question actually so far does not even arise. And that was just I wanted to add to make it clear. Okay, now we can take on.
Can I respond to that? Hemant? Can I quickly respond?
Please, please.
You see, Chinese are extremely pragmatic people. They're not into exporting their model. They can work with democracies, they can work with authoritarian regimes, so long as there is the mantra there is stability. And with stability comes opportunity for economic engagement. So geo-economic engagements become much more feasible if you have political stability. So you can deal with a Myanmar on one side, and you can deal with a Saudi or a UAE or a South Africa. So the systems don't really matter. You cut across systems and look at stability and whether it is good for China or not. I think that's a pragmatism which the Chinese exercise. But having said that, the Chinese roadmap for where they want to go was very clearly spelled out in the 19th Party Congress, the Xi Jinping's speech when he declared those two centenary goals, which was 2021, which was 100 years of the formation of the party, when you would have a moderately prosperous society, essentially doubling your GDP from what it was in 2010 and removal of extreme poverty. That was achieved. And then 2049, 100 years of the PRC's formation, by which time you would be the most developed countries. You would have achieved the Chinese dream. So those are those benchmarks which the Chinese have. And in between, probably 2035, it will surpass the US economy, if not earlier, the way they are going, despite whatever people say. So those are fixed goals. Now, how you achieve them, there is complete flexibility. You are non-ideological in that. You have to go and achieve those goals, and consensually if possible. But if there would be a situation, and if you have the capability of accessing force, I don't think the Chinese are force averse. I mean, the whole history of China, I mean, the entire long march and how the PRC got formed, I mean, they are not averse to violence, provided it goes and yields those meets those objectives which they've set for themselves. So I think they're completely flexible. And but again, I think they're also, as a society, very risk averse, Hemant. So that will be the last option of using force. To be honest, when I just to share an anecdote with you, I was there in August 2014. I just joined in Beijing, and I needed a kitchen knife for my kitchen. I went to the nearest supermarket and I asked for a knife, and they said no knife. Language was a problem, so I found a kitchen board which had a picture of a knife. So I showed it to the lady, I want this, and she balked like that. I was wondering, it's a kitchen knife, what the hell has happened? And then I came back, I met my colleague from PTI, KJM Verma. I asked him, I said, I can't find a kitchen knife. He said, what's the problem? He says, just before you came, there was a attack at Kunming railway station, a knife attack, and about 24 people were killed. And they withdrew knives after that. It's just that you overreact. You don't want. So that's the China. You don't want to take a risk. You overreact to it. So that is the kind of mindset of an ordinary Chinese, which I could guess for my first or second day in that country. So using force, deploying force is the last thing they would want to do. But at the same time, there's a strong party which is determined to achieve its goals. If push comes to shove, they would. But that's not the default position of the Chinese.
Okay. Alok, please take the next question.
Yes, the next question is by Cherry Kari. She thanks you for the insightful discussion. She asks, how do you assess the role of the Global Security Initiative in the region, considering China's reservation in competing with the US on security front?
Well, if I can answer quickly, GSI is a very new initiative. So I think it's yet to be tested out very clearly. So it will take time before we see how it really forms. Right now, there's a concept which has been floated. And it also shows Chinese scale of ambition or aspiration, word you want to use for that. But how it's that comprehensive security doctrine is going to be tested, it's very hard to say right now. I think we need more data points here before we can come to any kind of a conclusion over there. But the initiative is serious. And like the BRI, they're going to go ahead with it. And whether it succeeds or not, I think time will tell. I can't do more crystal balling there, unfortunately.
The next question is from Captain KK Agnihotri. He asked if Chinese will not intervene militarily in support of Iran, as you summarize. Then is there a chance for Chinese to act unconventionally and pressurize the US by leveraging their economic interdependence to force Israel to declare ceasefire, thus not escalating the conflict further?
I agree with the captain's question. I think that's the way the Chinese would do. You would do everything geo-economic, maybe even covert operations, sending weaponry, for example, without getting boots on the ground. All those options are open, I think, if it is required to achieve their interests. So unconventional way of not combat, but use of force, if you like, or uh, if you look at the military dimension, then you look at the unconventional way of going about it. I think the Chinese will have no qualms about it, but not in the way of putting boots in the ground. That will be the last option. But again, I do put a red flag there. If you think that that can lead to a regime survival and entering of conflict into Eurasia, then you will need these buffers like Iran with you, these pivotal states. Brzezinski had talked about these pivotal states, Iran being on the way pivots will determine the course of history in that region, or Ukraine, for example, another pivotal state. So Iran is a pivotal state, and the Chinese are conscious about it. They won't allow Iran to cave in and get a hostile regime in Iran, uh, given the geographic proximity of Iran and the Chinese. In that process, if a scenario arises when the Chinese have to use their force, they might use it as a means of last resort. But otherwise, all the means which the captain has suggested, they are deployable, including diplomacy, by the way. And that's where the earlier question sort of links up, which is the GSI. Would that become a forum which you will use to ensure? I'll just add last point here. If you look at the Iran-Saudi Arabia rapprochement, why did the Chinese take this diplomatic initiative? One is securing oil from the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranian oil which is coming through there. So if there's a ongoing confrontation between Saudis and the Iranians, so that would create a problem, apart from the prices of energy, etc. So that is one thing. And the Saudis were very keen, also realized that it's good to have a diplomatic rapprochement, because they were sick of this war in Yemen and the Houthis missile attacks, which were coming very close to some of the refineries in Saudi Arabia run by Aramco. So the Saudis too were okay of a Chinese mediation out there. So, I mean, here was a masterly use of diplomacy to promote Chinese energy interests. I think that's another tool which the Chinese would deploy. And that's where we got to see how this GSI fleshes out in the future.
Oh, there's another question, the last one by Musaib Rasool, a PhD candidate at Central University of Punjab. He wants to know how China's soft power approach by providing humanitarian aid to Gaza and vetoing for the ceasefire, etc., would give it a leverage in Palestine and the wider Middle East region, as setting a challenge for US to counter that through soft power means.
Uh, you know, the Chinese response to Gaza, and what I think it's not just aimed at the Palestinians, as I said during the earlier conversation, but really that's the constituency for the global South. You see, the Chinese have noticed how the UN General Assembly has voted when it comes to South Africa, to the global South. So they are very clear that that is the future constituency in which to consolidate. So that's why they're just going ahead with the Palestinian position, and also the reliance and dependence for high tech from Israel has reduced. So I think that's the reason, the overall approach of the Chinese towards this conflict. Essential constituency, global South, and that's what they're going to, that they're tapping. And if you look at a country like South Africa, for example, a major BRICS nation, it's gone ahead and gone to the International Court of Justice, charging Israel of genocide. So he knows the sentiment in Africa, in the global South. So I think Xi Jinping is very clear that the stance which they take on Palestine has to resonate strongly and in China's interest in the global south.
There are no more questions now.
Okay. So Atul, I will come in here with one or two observations and comments. I mean, for example, I've seen from October 7th onwards, that is last year, October 7th, and one thing which surprised me actually was that in the Chinese media, whether it was reporting or whether it was media commentaries or analysis of what was happening in Gaza post, there is such an overwhelming opinion in favor of Hamas and Palestine and against Israel. That is one very striking observation. I look at the Chinese media. And second is that many commentators, Chinese commentators, have written about it and out also that how Gaza, a crisis in Gaza, has actually helped China come out of its isolation, which China was facing pre-October 7 internationally. And how post-October 7, one, China has utilized very well to its advantage the international opinion against Israel and against the US of what followed October 7 Hamas attack. And China is actually best utilized to its advantage, especially also in, as has been repeatedly pointed out by you also, that China was looking at the global south at its consequence. Not exactly as you put it, the support for Palestine was a priority. Of course, vis-a-vis Israel it was. So in that context, I just want your comments on two very striking and very many Chinese commentators have pointed out these two things. That is that US has committed two very fundamental strategic follies in Gaza post October 7. First is that Washington should not have allowed Israel to argue that war with Palestine is an extension of the American global war on terror. Because it has been commented and discussed a lot that how many in America, even in the policy making circle, have linked the Hamas attack on October 7 as the continuation of the Arab terrorism or Muslim terrorism or Islamic terrorism, whichever way you put it. So that is one. And second point, which has been very frequently pointed out in the Chinese commentaries, is that Washington also needs to recognize that Israeli occupation of the West Bank is a primary cause of instability in the region and not the Arab terror. So please comment on that, because also taking advantage of your long stint covering those areas earlier.
Okay. Hemant, Israel, what happens on October 7th? I mean, the Israeli response is an extension of the global war on terror. I mean, that argument. I don't think there has been actually a generational change inside Israel as well, and to paint it as an extension of global war on terror has been, I would agree, a complete folly from the American side. And I think I don't see so many in the Biden and the Democratic camp following this line, but more from the Bush era people who would get reflected more in the Republican Party. I mean, this is not surprising though, because the Israeli lobby especially in an election year, is in overdrive in the United States.
Sorry to intervene here, but Jake Sullivan, for example, his initial comments were of that kind.
Yeah. So, I mean, even among Democrats, there are fault lines within them. But of course, National Security Advisor, one would assume he's reflecting the conviction of his boss, which is President Biden. Having said that, but I would still say that there are forces within the Democratic Party which are less hostile and more balanced than what would be there in a certain wing of the Republican Party. So I think that's something which they have got it completely wrong. But as I said, that because of the pressure coming from in election year from the Israeli lobby and the funding which they do for the elections, etc., I mean, they're extremely powerful. So that gets reflected in the policy positions which Washington takes. So you can't ignore its influence on that. But I would like to point here a bit of a nuance, because you also have divisions coming in the Israeli lobby, Hemant, and there is a section which is opposed to the war. Whether it gets into policy making, we don't see it, but there's a pressure group which has been formed in the United States now. You look at the campuses, the way they have been behaving. We had this ladies from Harvard and others, the presidents, and their response in the U.S. Senate, if I'm not mistaken. So there are fault lines which are coming in. I think there's also been a generational shift inside the United States, and Generation Z or millennials, they are not going to, they're not going to react the way earlier generation was reacting. They were highly sensitive, linked to social media, influenced by the images which they see on television. You see the media as well. I mean, BBC, for example, coming in. Then, of course, there are large pro-Palestinian populations which have immigrated into these countries, whether it's UK, whether it's Britain. So it's changing. This is one view of that's extension of global war on terror. But I think we got to catch the nuance here, that there are several parallel opinions which are coming in, which, by the way, were not there when, let's say, the Iraq war took place. In 2003, just before that, the run-up to that, we didn't have that. 9/11 was still fresh in people's memory. So global war on terror and putting everything under it was easier. But now I think there's going to be resistance to this. And it's interesting the way the American politics will go in this direction. But yet, having said that, finally, the old guard of the Jewish lobby still is predominant, but it is being challenged. That would what I would say to your question regarding Israel, whether it's a folly of the US. I think it is, because they're not catching the tide. There's a new tide which is building up in the United States, which might haunt them domestically. Also, the need for recognized West Bank. Things are happening out there. We are all sort of fixated on Gaza right now, but there are changes which are taking place, and there's a lot of violence which is going on in the West Bank right now. And then you see the Jordanian side can get infected. So this is not over. The expansion of the conflict, we're all looking whether it expands from Gaza into Hezbollah and others. But there is even a possibility of going northwards towards Jordan and those geographies and expanding from there. I would make one more observation, Hemant, which is about the Chinese position. I think they have lost a trick here for their own interest. They have not condemned Hamas. But if you look at their main allies, let's say Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia or UAE, for example, countries which they are investing very heavily into, they are totally averse to Hamas, because Hamas is an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was backed by the Qataris. The Egyptians were the ones who cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood once after 2011 Mubarak went, and you had Mohammad Morsi coming as the president from Muslim Brotherhood. So Al-Sisi was the one who cracked down, the present president. And the old Nasserite military elite came back and smashed them really in there. And the same thing happened because the main prime movers of a change in Bahrain or in UAE and eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia were really the Muslim Brotherhood people. And Hamas is an extension of that. So if you are siding with Hamas, if the Chinese are siding too much with Hamas, then you have the possibility of alienating the Saudis and the UAE. So here, I think they should go, I mean, more into general rubric of the Palestinians rather than going ahead with tacitly seemingly supporting Hamas, because that's not going to gel very well in the region because it's divided clearly. And some of Chinese allies or Chinese friends, put it partners, are somebody who are very, very wary of Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. So it's important that within the GCC we need to recognize these fault lines. Qatar is on a limb on the other side, Saudis, UAE together here, and Bahrain really doesn't matter so much. Sorry to say that it's too small to influence the first country where oil was discovered. So I think the Chinese probably, in my view, they might sort of tweak their position on Palestine, especially trying to find somebody who's a post Mahmoud Abbas kind of a character, more linked to the Fatah and that line of thinking, who would be more acceptable for a two-state solution finally, which seems to be the only option. Whatever form it comes is different, but if you want to resolve this, then it has to be a two-state solution. There can't be anything else, as far as I can see.
Very quick response to what you just now said on the Chinese not having condemned Hamas so far. I mean, when I look at the Chinese debates, one of the reasons why they have done that also is to be seen in the context of, at the same time, they have been, although it took them some time, but once they took this position, they have been very consistent with this, that of two-state solution. And when they're talking of two-state solution, and one of the main obstacles, the problems from the Palestinian side is also being debated in many Chinese articles, where they say that the problem is that the Palestinian divisions among themselves. And that is indirectly a reference to the Palestinian organization and Hamas on the other hand. So what I'm trying to say is that they think that having taken this position of two-state solution to the immediate crisis also, and generally, like the previous point which I had made, that many Chinese have been pointing out that the real reason behind the instability in the region is the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. So how do you see this? I mean, Saudi, of course, everybody knows that till Beijing succeeded in bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia to the peace agreement. Saudi was financing and maybe sponsoring groups fighting against Iran, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So the Chinese still went ahead and they succeeded in doing that. In fact, a Chinese scholar told me that had America not completely isolated or tried to isolate and pressurize China in the region, perhaps Chinese would not even have taken the initiative of brokering a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yeah, Hemant, actually the change took place inside the GCC, especially Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I cited these two incidents. Arab Spring was a very important turning point in the GCC line of thinking, where they were fearful that the Americans are the one who are backing the Arab Spring and regime changes, and they would be on the firing line if they continued to put all their eggs in the American basket. So that's where the pivot comes in countries like UAE and Saudi especially. And that's where the whole idea to discover China comes in big time at that time. And again, Iran sanctioned badly. I mean, that relationship with China was building up for a very long time. And the Chinese consolidated on that. So the moment was opportune. And second thing was that the Saudis, the Iranians were ready for this because they wanted more stability in the region, getting into SCO and others. So they were more ready for that. But Saudis also, the Khashoggi affair is an important one. It is not of an individual, but it's that the Americans can turn so hostile against you. And Saudis think they are the granddads of the region. I mean, for various spiritual reasons, Mecca, so they have they are in a way, Turkey thinks they're successor of the Ottoman Empire, but Saudis think that they are really have a global standing in the Muslim world, which is higher than anybody else's. So so the Saudis, after being facing what came from the United States, were also and a new leadership. That's again the personality factor also is important, because MBS was looking for afresh. And they thought, why not the Chinese? Remember, MBS didn't take Biden's calls for a long time. He was calling him and they didn't take his call. So this is the new Middle East which is emerging, the GCC, where they are exercising their strategic autonomy like never before, Hemant. And this I find fascinating. And it's just not with the Chinese. Again, with India as well. You see today, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed being received for this vibrant Gujarat show, and they're going ahead with it because they also see India as part of this diversification from the United States. But from the Indian perspective, I think just as the Chinese have demonstrated, we need also to exercise that our strategic autonomy, that we are not part of an alliance system of the Americans. Otherwise, this will fall flat. If the perception arises that India becomes an appendage of the West, then your whole game of engaging independently with these countries in the Gulf, etc., because they are looking for alternatives to the US and the Americans. I think we should fall in that bracket as well. And I think there's a great opportunity here for India to exercise this strategic autonomy, just as the Saudis and the Iranians and the Chinese are doing it. That we should also be doing it. We'll gain far more respect from these countries than we would if we were to go and seen as a quasi ally of the West.
What about the IMEC?
I think it finally can get integrated with the other. I mean, for my point of view, you got to have the North-South corridor, INSTC, International North-South Transport. So you got to actually engage both with the Russians and with the Chinese. We have a problem with them at the border, but if you really look at it in a long-term vision, I mean, the Chinese have gone ahead. Others are reacting to China. The initiative is with the Chinese. The Americans are reacting. You see Macron going to Xi Jinping, Scholz going to Xi Jinping. I mean, the Chinese have moved forward. They've got that escape velocity now. And they would matter, objectively speaking, just as the Russians would matter. I'm glad we are buying Russian oil and exercising our autonomy. At some point, we got to engage Eurasia big time. So these corridors will become very important. The Chabahar route, which is going to Afghanistan, irrespective of whatever pressure comes on India, as would be the international North-South transport corridor and the integration of these two, along with India's investment in the Russian Far East. I think that's where India's future, and if you really talk about India as a civilizational states, it is here that you have those civilizational links, which are very, very profound and strong. So I think that balancing needs to come with the exercise of strategic autonomy and engaging everyone. I'm not saying you don't engage the Americans. If you get technology, etc., from them, please go ahead. And but only thing is, and nobody says that, but don't get into this tilts on one side, or at least the perception of that. Just exercise India's core interests and India's autonomy and engage everyone. I think that's the way the Chinese are doing it. You take a lead.
Thank you. Excellent. Excellent. Alok, I think there are new questions which have come up. You have to mute yourself, Alok. Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yes, there is a question by Satrupa Bhattacharya for both of you. For Atul, investments aside, does China really understand the Middle East enough to have an influence similar or more than the US in the years to come? And for Dr. Adlaka, she asks, how is China trying to be the voice of the global South with regard to the Israel-Hamas war with its position at the UN? Do China have a role in the reconstruction of Gaza's physical reconstruction? If so, how?
Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sadrupa. Sadrupa knows China because she had worked for China Daily for quite some time. I had known her in Beijing as well. So, uh, does China understand the Middle East? Geo-economically, I think they do when it comes to investments and getting the stock exchanges together, funding startups. So those things Chinese are good at. Then you come to the cultural understanding and I think that's where the Chinese need to work up a little more to understand the inner nuances of how the systems work in that part of the world. I'll give you a small example. I was new to my posting in Bahrain, and I heard about the Shamar tribe. I said, what is the Shamar tribe? I just dug into that, and it's a tribe which extends from Iraq and then goes into the GCC. So the first thing which came is that, I should not be looking at these places as nation states, looking more at the tribal kind of culture which they have and the interconnections, because that is a factor which is deciding their policies. Now, those are the kind, I'm just giving an example, that the Chinese need to get into those kind of nitty-gritty nuances, individuals, people, pivotal influencers in this part of the world, which are not there. You don't see them on the surface. And I think, given the importance of the Middle East to China, it's a matter of time before they will get it. They'll invest a lot, if they've not already done so, in their universities, in their think tanks, etc., to look into this, because this region is very, very important now to them. With the US withdrawal, or partial withdrawal towards the Indo-Pacific, towards the Asia Pacific, if you like, I think that's where the Chinese are. There's a partial vacuum. I wouldn't say there's a vacuum, but there's a partial vacuum which the Chinese are filling in, and they see their outlet from the kind of constraints which are being put on the West. So, given the importance of the Middle East to the Chinese, I think it's a matter of time before they get this one also right, the understanding of the people of the region.
Okay, thank you, Shotrupa, for the question addressed to me. Very briefly, I'll try to link the question of what just now Atul said, earlier question, whether Chinese really understand the Middle East, and link it with the question addressed to me. I mean, I remember I read somewhere that when Kissinger succeeded in negotiating an agreement in 1973, in Egypt and Israel, and Kissinger had boasted also at that time that only it was the US who was influential and present in the region. There was no European presence there. There was no Soviet Union presence there. Definitely, there was no Chinese presence there. And if you look at now, for example, as Atul also has mentioned earlier, and as we all know now, that whether it is MENA, that is Middle East and North Africa, or strictly speaking of the China today is there as largest importer of oil, as we mentioned earlier. And also, Atul has already mentioned the figures of the trade China and the Middle East region has, which is actually more than 3 times America has with the region. And the Chinese investment in the region, and the Chinese developmental projects, which I mentioned earlier, the number of projects and the number of countries involved in those projects, whether under BRI or otherwise. For example, I was reading somewhere that China has built or constructed more than 1,000 schools in Iraq in the recent years. And so these are the kind of things which China at one level is making inroads into the region. And on the other hand, now linking it to the question which was addressed to me about Global South, how China is utilizing this crisis in Gaza. I mean, one very apparent visible advantage which China has been able to take for itself is, as I mentioned earlier, that this has given China a huge scope to put an end to its so-called isolation, which it had been facing, especially during the COVID 3 years period or 2 years period, and thereafter the US or the US West-led economic isolation of China, and with the active or proactive expansion of activities under the BRI umbrella in the region. If you look at all these things, I mean, definitely, as I mentioned earlier also, that China was able to not only very timely look at it, but also use it as a leverage to completely mobilize opinion, not only in favor of China taking sides of Palestine people and what Israel was doing to people of Gaza post October 7. Not only that, but also in isolating and joining this kind of a anti-US campaign to say that how it is actually the US war Israel is fighting in Gaza. Like exactly on the pattern of what Chinese position has been, what is happening in Ukraine. The Chinese have always, without any confusion or without any doubt, made it clear at every forum, wherever they got a chance, that what was happening, what has been happening in Ukraine it is a US war against Russia. And similarly, now what is happening or what has been happening in Gaza, of course, we all know that now there's more than 23,000 Gaza people who have been killed post October 7. More than 56,000 people perhaps who have been completely rendered houseless or homeless, etc. And the Chinese have been very, very effectively building on this campaign that it is being done by the US. And had the US not been protecting or supplying arms and financial support to Israel, Israel would not have been in this position to carry out so-called genocide against people of Gaza. So all these things have definitely consolidated the Chinese position within the global South, as China has been seen as standing with the voice of the global South on this issue. I think and about the reconstruction, I think that's too premature now or too early to say anything about whether China is looking at involving or participating in the reconstruction of the region. I think it's too premature to say anything more. Batul want to add to that, please.
No, Hemant, I think you've been very comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that brings us to the close of this webinar. We are now almost reaching 4:30, which is standard time, which is allotted from 3 to 4:30. Alok, over to you.
Do I have your permission? May I end this session?
Yes, please. And before you do that, let me once again thank Atul and acknowledge his excellent presentation today, and also especially the way he explained very well various questions which had come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hemant. What a pleasure. And great to reconnect after decades, I think.
Welcome. Alok, over to you.
With this, we have come to an end for today's session. I thank you all for joining us. We also like to thank Dr. Adlaka and Mr. Aneja for their precious time and for gracing us with their presence. The video of this session will be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We welcome you all to join us for the next Wednesday seminar titled China and India Imponderable Bilateral. Information related to Wednesday seminar can be found on our website, or you can also subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you.